Hello, and thanks for joining us for a conversation on talking to children about death and dying. My name is Joe Primo, and I'm the CEO of Good Grief. And today we're going to address some of the key elements for parents in having conversations with your children about COVID 19 and death. This webinar happens to be preceded by another one called Building Resilience in Children During a Pandemic. And the content in that webinar is foundational to this one, but it's not critical to understanding today's teaching points. So, to get us started, I want to acknowledge that these are scary times, and many of the questions that adults are asking and find themselves worried about are not that different than those filling the thoughts of children. And of course, some of these questions might include: who will die? Will I die? Who do I know that will die from coronavirus? How bad is this going to get? What will life be like when this is over? And of course, when will this be over? Death is a tough topic to talk freely about in our culture, but COVID 19 is an opportunity for us to disrupt our discomfort with death and grief and make the next generation more resilient and much healthier. In order for us to understand and to begin framing this, we must remember that all living creatures will one die, and nothing can stop this inevitable outcome. And so, how we prepare a child to understand this reality can impact their overall health and their future. So, in order to empower you and hopefully help you feel comfortable having these conversations, I want to offer some guiding concepts. Guess what? You don't have to have all the answers. It's important that you create a safe environment for exploring thoughts and feelings by focusing in on empathy, understanding, and patience. Honesty and facts are going to be critical here. Turns out death is a biological event. Understanding the biological nature of death before moving into spiritual and religious concepts are going to be really important, because the spiritual and religious concepts are abstract and they take longer for a child to understand. And lastly, the finality of death might not click right away. So repetition is going to be really helpful, which is to say, a child might say and understand grandma is dead, then shortly thereafter ask when grandma will visit next. That's a normal response. These guiding concepts here hopefully are going to help you remain grounded as you're approaching these conversations. So remember that it's not about getting it right the first time, but creating the space for honest exploration. So kids will likely have many more questions over time. And because you've created that safe space, they're going to be able and willing and comfortable to ask you as the pandemic unfolds. And of course, this is an evolving um, thing. So, in order to help a child understand death during this pandemic, the first thing we must remember is that we don't know what a child is thinking until they tell us. I'm going to present this information from the perspective of a child bringing up the topic with you rather than the other way around, just for the ease of sharing this information. But what I have to share here is applicable in both instances. So, first, don't make assumptions. Just because you're in lockdown in the house together all day, don't assume that a sibling, the news, something online, or some other source hasn't provided a child with some information on coronavirus or how many people might die from it. And at the time of this webinar being recorded, the president said that up to 200,000, 240,000 people could die, which to a child could sound like 200 trillion people, right, from the child's perspective. So take the time to understand what a child is thinking and what they have or haven't heard by asking open-ended questions. If you take the time up front, that's going to help you know how to answer and respond to their questions about death. The next thing we need to do is identify a child's current points of reference. when they're talking about death. So, has the child ever experienced the death of a person in their life? Who was that person? What was the nature of the relationship with that person? How did that person die? Are there any aspects to this point of reference that will help you build upon when talking about coronavirus? So essentially, by identifying these points of reference, we're really trying to establish a baseline of knowledge, see if there are any misconceptions and possible fears or questions just right out of the gates. And our goal here is not just to try to find similarities between coronavirus and past experiences, because differentiating factors are also helpful. So, for example, coronavirus is not like Kobe Bryant's helicopter crash. It's not like cancer. It's not like a brain aneurysm. And yet, all of these things cause death. So, you can get this conversation started um, with a few of these open ended questions. Who do we know who has died? What do you think happens when we die? What have you heard other people say about death? You can ask these questions because your job right now is not to gather data and then quickly correct misinformation or inject your own opinion. Because remember, you're trying to establish a baseline of knowledge and thoughts around what a child knows. And a child may not know anybody who has died. And you certainly can use other points of reference, including a pet. And of course, there's a lot of death in movies and cartoons, but it's important to note that those references may or may not get you an authentic understanding, since those types of deaths oftentimes are sensational and not clear or realistic. But it is possible for a fictitious character to help a child understand death. And now that you've identified these point of references and have some information on their intellectual perspective, you can move towards understanding their emotional baseline. So, in order to do that, you can ask some questions like these. How does it make you feel to know that people die? Does it worry you that people are dying because of coronavirus? What feelings do you have when you think about death? In both instances, how a child understands death and has feelings about it depends on lived experience and also cognitive development. And regarding the latter, we do have a tip sheet on our website, good-grief.org, on the resources page that shows how a child might understand death within these developmental frameworks. So that's to say, while a child's cognitive and emotional response is going to depend on maturity, there are other key ingredients here that are going to be um, pretty universal. So, as kids explore the subject matter with you, which is likely going to be accompanied by fear and anxiety, it's important that you create a safe environment. So, we've gone from identifying intellectual, emotional baseline into, okay, well, what are we going to do now? And that is the safe environment. And you can do this with some of these key ingredients. Listen without interrupting or correcting. Be patient. Affirm their feelings. Don't judge. Tune out your own mental distractions. Be honest. Provide facts and provide gentleness and compassion. Because ultimately, by creating an environment with these qualities, you're going to allow for more sharing from the child, because the child will feel safe and the child will feel heard. And with this baseline of knowledge and understanding the child's point of references and feelings, now is the time to begin talking about death. So, what does it mean to be dead? Where do we go when we die? What is the meaning of life? And as we all know, these questions tend to get bundled together, and many philosophers, theologians, scientists, and people with opinions have spent plenty of time trying to answer these questions, and they're hard questions. And now here we have a child seeking an honest and clear answer to these tough questions. And the thing is, you don't have to arrive to this conversation with a clear statement on the meaning of life in order to be effective. I can promise you that. The one question, though, that you can answer with certainty is, what does it mean to be dead? Because death is a biological event. A biological events have a sequence, just like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. And when framed in this way, we can help a child understand the finite nature of death. But in order to understand what it means to be dead, we can look to what it means to be alive. Because when we're alive, we need to drink water, eat food, sleep, shower, brush our teeth, exercise to stay healthy. We can talk to friends on the phone. We can text. We can watch our favorite shows, play sports, take naps, pet the dog, do homework, etc. But when we are dead, we no longer need to drink water, eat food, sleep, shower, or exercise. We can no longer call friends, play sports, hug our friends, or pet the dog because we're dead. And as a child understands what it means to be dead, that safe space that you created is going to be so important for their vulnerability as they explore deadness and its ramifications on their life. Another way to help a child understand death is to remember that death is a mechanical malfunction. Think about children's toys. They understand puzzles and parts, they understand sharing and interconnectivity of objects. And here's the convenient thing: the body is a machine. And where one organ fails, everything else goes haywire. So let's use a heart attack as an example. The heart is a critical organ. If the heart doesn't work, neither does anything else. So to put this through the lens of a kid and having a conversation with them, first, let's ask the child to take a deep breath. Wow, feel all that air going into your lungs. Now, have the child put their hand on their chest. Do you feel that? Boom, ba bum, bum bum. That's your heart beating, right? Well, do you know what the heart does? Yep, that's right. It pumps blood. Do you know what's in the blood? Oxygen, the stuff that we breathe. Our entire body and every organ need oxygen. If our heart is not beating and there is no thump, 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 then no oxygen can get to our brain or our kidneys or our toes. If our heart isn't working, all of our other organs stop working. If our heart is not beating and our lungs are not full of oxygen, then we die. I think this is an important image for coronavirus because ultimately we don't want children to think that COVID-19 is just the common cold, because every single sniffle could scare the heck out of a kid. Kids need honest facts to understand what COVID-19 is. And of course, there are obviously many iterations of how this disease can unfold in a person. But because it is a respiratory disease, it affects the lungs, which affects oxygen and the job of the heart, and that can lead to death. So you can see how the biology and mechanical nature of death helps a child understand the disease, its progress, and what happens. And as we've already mentioned here, facts help a child understand. So, as you're having this conversation, it's not okay to say that you aren't going to die if a child asks, "Hey, are you going to get this? Are you going to die?" Because if you do that, a child is going to recognize that you're not being honest. Instead, as you're approaching this conversation and they ask that question, you can respond with doctors found that most people who are older, most people who die are older because their bodies aren't as strong at fighting disease like a young person's body. I'm older than you, but younger than others. And for sure, with an honest and factual response like this, that may very well mean that a child is going to ask about their grandparents or other aging people in their life. And I think that there are two important ways here to proceed. First, explain the importance of physical distancing and why that is helping grandparents and other aging people to stay safe. And also, don't be surprised if the next time a kid is on a phone call or a video call with a grandparent, if they start policing that grandparent's movement and action, right? They want to know that person's going to be safe and be okay. And of course, you can sit back and enjoy this spectacle, see how that goes, or you can ask the adults in a child's life to disclose what they're doing to stay safe and cautious up front, to provide comfort to the kids. So, in the times of COVID-19, I think ultimately you have a parenting choice about the values that you want to instill in a child. And these values can include things like kindness, having an appreciation for people like doctors, nurses, first responders, cashiers, expressing love, the importance of reaching out to the important people in their lives. Just these are just to name a few. And at Good Grief, we talk a lot about empowering children to become more resilient by allowing them to think all of their thoughts and feel all of their feelings, which allows them to keep on living and loving. I think this values proposition is a part of this and a part of their resilience building, because ultimately going on to live and love, despite the fact that you now know that every living creature will one day die, is pretty incredible when you take the time to think about it. Because really, why should we endure this pain and this fear if we know we're going to die anyways? That's a very big thought for us as adults. That's a very big thought for a kid to wrestle with. And yet, I've seen so many times at Good Grief with grieving children that they are able to discern this and then have their own conclusions as to why. And this is true for their feelings too, the big and scary feelings like, what if my whole family dies of coronavirus and I'm the only one left? What will I do? And I would not be surprised if kids all over the world are staying up late at night wondering about this question. And so when we think about our answer to these questions, when they're directed to us as parents and adults, when they come to us seeking guidance, what is it that we will say to them? What do you want a child to take away from this lived experience, this time of living in a pandemic? And who do you want your children to become as living creatures that will one day die? That ultimately is a values proposition that I can't answer for you. But a child also cannot consider these questions for themselves if they are not given the facts to understand death, to understand this pandemic, or if they're not given a caring and safe environment that allows for this type of questioning and exploration and ultimately receiving guidance from the adults in their lives. So I hope that one of the things that you're hearing here is that our adult mindset is a significant influencer on a child's understanding of death. But that is not the only thing that influences a child's understanding. They're also influenced by their peer group. They're influenced by culture, which can include geographic, socioeconomic, religious, and other types of variables. They're influenced by their exposure via media or personal experience. the environment where they live, learn, and play, and of course, stigmas and misinformation that are propagated most often within culture and media. So, when you think about all of these different influencers, it's my hope that that inspires you to want to take charge of this conversation and get ahead of these influencers shaping your child's learning and resilience. So, with that in mind, to recap some things here, we started with the goal of empowering you as a parent to feel comfortable to talk about death and COVID 19 openly and freely with your child. And it's your willingness, I think, to approach this conversation that's ultimately going to lead to building resilience within your child. And remember that creating a safe environment, utilizing the biological nature and flow of death, and continuing to revisit and allowing for continued honest exploration with your child is really going to make all the difference. And to support these conversations and this mindset. We have many more resources about the subject on our website, good-grief.org. Be sure to check out the resources page, also the webinar that we've already published on building resilience in your children. These things will help guide your mindset for these conversations. And it is absolutely okay to be timid about approaching this conversation. Just remember that it's so much better to have the conversation than to ignore it and hope it works itself out. Ultimately, there's way too much at stake for us not to invest in our children's resilience in the face of death and grief during COVID 19 and for the rest of their lives. Because ultimately, what we're talking about is building resilience for this adversity and future adversities. So, thank you for being vulnerable and courageous and for having these important conversations with the children in your life. And again, you can get more resources at good-grief.org. Please take good care and be well.